Kingdom to fix these things appropriately. So with those eyes of mind, I'm going to ask our first speaker, Andrew Natsios, who's sitting here on my left, who's a lecturer at Georgetown University and a former administrator of USAID. He has a phenomenal CV and biography. It reads absolutely princely and well-deserved for the honours. The previous president had appointed him in the United States as Special Coordinator for International Disaster Assistance and Humanitarian Coordinator for the Sudan, so he understands the country and its issues extremely well. He'd also been Vice President of World Vision US, so understands the issues from the point of view of the not-for-government sector and the charitable sector, and of course he's worked effectively within the legislature in the United States. Andrew, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much.
Would you like to use the podium, or do you?
Yes, I actually would prefer it.
If you would, that'd be very kind. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Alison. I appreciate it. I haven't congratulated you on your appointment. It's a pleasure to be here today talking about a subject that's important to all of us, personally important to me. I've written a lot on it and doing a book on foreign aid and development, and also a book on Sudan. I'm just about to sign a contract with a publisher for a book on Sudan. So these are important subjects. One of the things that troubles me when I look at foreign aid and I look at development theory is the growing gap between development theory. When I say development theory, I mean the best minds, most of whom are development economists, which is a problem because there's a lack of balance in a lot of the literature. There aren't enough political scientists, enough anthropologists, enough people in other disciplines looking at the same issues. Economists, we need them badly, but they dominate the literature. Nevertheless, the ones who look at things in a macro sense and the ones that look at specific issues in specific countries have come out with a lot of writing. The think tanks, like ODI, like the Center for Global Development in Washington, come out with a lot of very good studies, evaluations, reports, and then you look at development practice, the way we actually do it, and it seems to me that, at least in my experience, 20 years in this work, there's been a growing gap between the theory and the practice. And the reason for that, I believe, is because of politics. Politics in the countries we're working in, and politics in the international system, and politics in the capitals of the countries that are funding aid programs. And one of the first half of this book that I'm writing deals with the four clashes. The four clashes from an aid perspective are the clash of development and diplomacy, the clash of defense and diplomacy, the clash of politics and diplomacy, and finally the clash which is the least studied of, I call them the regulatory lords. You can call it, in the literature in the US and political science, it's called the counter-bureaucracy and development. And I want to just make a couple of comments about this last one, because we all know, and whether you're a diplomat or an aid officer bilaterally, any of the donor governments, or a military officer, and I've been all three. I was a lieutenant colonel in the Army Reserves. I served in the first Gulf War. I was a civil affairs officer. I was in 23 years, so I know the military, and I know particularly the part of the military that deals with conflicts and reconstruction and civilians. I was a diplomat for a year and a half as the U.S. envoy to Sudan, so I did that for a year and a half as an American diplomat, and of course spent most of my time as an aid officer, both in the NGO world, but also in USAID. And now I'm able to step back and watch all of this. And I think that there is an understanding that these clashes exist, but what is little understood and little studied, in fact there's almost no literature on it, is what effect the oversight agencies of bilateral donor governments have on development practice. And a lot of what USAID has become, in fact, is a function of the Office of the Inspector General, the Office of Management and the Budget that controls the systems of accountability in the federal government, the General Accounting Office, the GAO it's called, which is the compliance arm of the U.S. Congress. It's a competitor of the Office of Management and the Budget, which is part of the White House. And then there's a special inspector general for Iraqi reconstruction. They appointed another special inspector general for Afghan reconstruction. And then there are numerous other federal agencies that control almost every aspect of what AID does, or the Millennium Challenge Corporation does, or any of the aid work of the U.S. government. The layering of accountability systems in the U.S. government has had an effect, profound effect, on our public bureaucracies. These systems were designed over a period of years to basically put controls on the growth of the federal government and to basically limit the bad things that happen in government. Because there's a suspicion in the United States, on the left and the right, that the government is bad, that it's dangerous, that we can't allow too much power to be vested in any office to do anything. Everybody has to be watched all the time. The net effect of that is we've built a system that has severe constraints on it. There's a wonderful book written 20 years ago by a former professor of mine who I had 30 years ago for the course that led to him writing the book. His name is James Q. Wilson, and he wrote a book called Bureaucracy. And if you want to understand how the federal system works in reality, not in theory, in reality, read James Q. Wilson's book, Bureaucracy. If you read that book, you get depressed, particularly if you're about to take over a federal agency. I read it 3 times before I took over AID, because everything in that book is true. He wrote it before the growth of the counter-bureaucracy controlling AID to the degree it has now. And that's 3 chapters in my book. I'm about to publish this as an essay with the Center for Global Development because it needs to get out now. A lot of the people who are discussing aid reform in Washington haven't the slightest idea what the effects of the counter-bureaucracy are on aid practice, and they are quite profound. The second point is related to this, and that is the counter-bureaucracy in Washington is forcing AID to move more and more into service delivery in its aid programs. The best example of this is the HIV/AIDS program, President Bush's signature program. PEPFAR is called, Presidential Emergency Response, Emergency HIV/AIDS program. And that program used parallel structures, contractors, NGOs, church groups, universities, to administer a program that literally went into effect within weeks of its signature. The contractors and NGOs that ran this huge program, it was a $15 billion program, $3 billion a year. I'm sorry, it's 5-year program, $3 billion a year for $15 billion total. And it's been renewed now at $48 billion. It's inconceivable to me how we could possibly spend in sub-Saharan Africa $48 billion in 5 years on HIV/AIDS, given the serious absorptive capacity. But Congress passed the money. And when I say service delivery, we typically look at aid programs through sectors. You know, that there's sector-based development, whether you're in the emergency side, you know, we have these clusters, 4 clusters. And then we have, on the development side, we have international health, we have infrastructure, we have education. Just go through the list. And aid agencies call them slightly different things, but they're basically all focused on sectors. Sectors really are misleading people in terms of what we really should be doing. Our oversight agencies in Washington think the sectors of international development are the same as sectors domestically. And so when they see health, they look at our domestic health programs and think that we need to focus on the measurement of service delivery. How many children were immunized in the United States or Africa or anywhere else? It's all the same, isn't it? Immunizing a child in Boston is the same as immunizing a child in Kinshasa. Of course, there's absolutely no difference at all. You're supposed to laugh at that because there is a little difference between the two, okay? What we really should be focusing on is the measurement of institution building in order to do immunizations in developing countries. Because capacity building and ownership are all about building indigenous capacity to do this. That is not what we're measuring. We're measuring the carrying out of services. And as a result of that, we are distorting what we are actually doing in the field. We are measuring, and the other Ds, the Defense Department and the State Department, the other diplomacy, which I think is a similar problem in other Western countries. It's severe in the United States, but I see it happen in Europe as well, is that diplomats and military officers think what the principal focus of aid agencies should be is to making sure that children are immunized and the oral rehydration salts. They don't really know what those are, but they have to get passed out. And how many health clinics? We used to have fights at the monthly meetings on Afghanistan because the Defense Department said there are two ways we're going to judge AID. How fast you disperse money, which is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. But that has nevertheless been for 40 years. All administrations, liberal, conservative, nothing to do with ideology. OMB judges AID about how fast it disperses money. We created a system that disperses money faster than almost any other agency in the world. We've actually checked on that. That's why we have the aid system we have. We were told that's how you're judged. Well, we disperse money very rapidly now. It may not be the best way to do the work, but it does disperse money. And the second thing, we don't have a lot of audit findings. If you actually look at the audits, I had one of my students read all the audits for Afghanistan, I'm sorry, for Iraq, 150 of them. He almost went stark raving mad as he did it. He said, "Professor, do I have to read all?" I said, "You need to read every single one of them." Did you find any systemic corruption in the aid program? The answer was no. And that's not the impression in the news media that you get, but that is, in fact, what you read. What they say is, in these audits, going back, which is a big issue with auditors and with oversight agencies, this program wasn't done on time. You said in 2 years you'd have rebuilt 2,400 schools. I said, well, look, we can get all this done very rapidly. We can have a big engineering company go in and do this, but it means we won't be able to talk to the Ministry of Education as to which schools should be redone, how they should be redone, whether there are teachers for the schools and textbooks for the schools. That's irrelevant. All we care about is whether the 2,400 schools were done on time. That's what the contract says. We want to know whether it's done. I said the bigger question is whether the Ministry of Education in Sudan, Iraq, Afghanistan, anywhere, can actually get the job done without us. In other words, on their own, through their own systems. What are you talking about? All we care about is whether the 2,400 schools were rebuilt in the 2 years this contract. That's what they audit. And so the focus is on service delivery, not institution building. The third thing that aid agencies should be doing, aid used to do it extensively, very effectively, I might add. If you look at the historical record, it's almost unknown in Washington, unfortunately, is policy dialogue. That's what we call it. Other people call it different things, but it essentially is an ongoing discussion between the ministries or the private sector, parliamentarians, if there are any parliamentarians, on policy reform, policy changes, because development's all about reform and change, and that's really, this dialogue is essential. Whenever you talk with another person, even at the federal level in the United States, it slows everything down. So if you're judging an aid agency by how fast it does things, whether it disperses the money quickly and gets the project done on time, in my view, it's probably a failed development program, because it means you're not talking with anybody on the ground. That's what the auditors look at. If you read you read the audits of AID, and people, I've had military officers absolutely trash the program. They said, "You were late on all these things." I said, "That's because our rule in AID is we don't put any schools anywhere in any country unless the Ministry of Education in the country has approved every single school in writing, individually, or we won't do it." The Defense Department built a whole bunch of schools in Afghanistan very rapidly. They never talked to the Ministry of Education, and there were never any teachers in the schools, never any textbooks, never any students, but they were done very rapidly. Okay? Did we fail? Well, I think we succeeded because we, in fact, all the schools were approved, and therefore there were teachers in them and there were textbooks, although that is also sometimes problematic. Okay. Which leads me to the next point. Why is it that we're having problems in fragile states, failed states, and recovering states? Well, it's all about institutions, or the absence of them. And there is a new book I would commend to you by 3 American writers, Douglas North, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics. Not that that's, I say this advisedly, is a necessarily great distinction, given some of the people who get Nobel Prizes for things nowadays. But Douglas North is a hero of mine, okay? And he is almost 90 years old, and he invented a thing called institutional economics. And institutional economics basically changed the dynamic about development economics. And what he said was that institutions, which are the rules of the game, he defines institutions a little bit differently than we define them, the rules of the game, or the norms that are unspoken, not necessarily written down, in any system that guide how people in the institutions behave. And economists used to believe that these norms and these rules of the game were irrelevant in terms of growth, or neutral. And we now know that's complete nonsense. They're not neutral, they're essential. And what norms allow to happen is what Douglas North talks about, is impersonal means of exchange. In other words, that allows you to buy a stock in the New York or the London Stock Exchange without knowing the person you're buying the stock from. You don't know the person you bought the stock from. And the system prior to the development of norms around stock markets and capital markets is you had to know the person personally that you were doing an economic transaction with. That's the old system. That's a traditional system that's existed for 10,000 years, where you know the person you're dealing with economically. Modern governments provide services to people that they don't know. When you go get your driver's license, you don't know who the person giving your driver's license is. You get it done through a large technocratic state that's evolved to provide public services. There was a study done of driver's licenses in India. No one gets driver's licenses in India based on impersonal exchange. You have to know someone in the system, because the driver license system is connected to the political system, and politicians use power in a stable country like India in order to build their networks of control and influence. Now, we still have that in Western countries too. It happens in cities in the United States, but it's not the dominant force. We still provide services on an impersonal basis. What Douglas North says is that if you don't look at the way institutions function, or whether they exist at all, whether they be the organizational structure of an institution or the norms that are the foundation of institution, you cannot understand how the society works, and you certainly can't get anything done in the society. And what distinguishes a highly advanced society and those which are poor is the density of institutions. And they provide data in the book to show that that is the magic formula. It's not magic, but the explanatory formula between a highly developed society and those that are not are the amount of formal institutions, the density of those institutions. Why is that relevant? Because in most failed states, they're failed because whatever traditional institutions existed have been destroyed. Certainly that happened. The longer the war is, the fewer institutions there are. If you look at Afghanistan, when we arrived in early 2002, and I say we, the Western powers with the military force and the aid agencies in the international system, after Taliban was defeated the first time, temporarily, you will see that most of the traditional institutions that existed in Afghanistan that made it run were completely destroyed. You have an what you basically had were an economy of warlords, of drug money, of weapons markets, of kidnappings and ransoms being paid. I mean, destruction of the traditional order of Afghan society. And restoring institutions is what this is all about. It is not the delivery of services. It's building those institutions. Now, that takes a very long time to do. The notion that we in 5 years or 6 years or even 10 years are going to build institutions that took the Anglo-Saxon world hundreds of years to build overnight, it seems to me to be delusional, frankly. When I noticed you're reading Ashraf Ghani's book, and I had yelling matches with Ashraf, okay? One of the things he says in this book is it's possible to build capacity in just a couple of years. Transfer all the money through budget support, everything will just be fine. He actually says that in the book. That is complete nonsense. There's absolutely no empirical evidence anywhere that we can build functioning institutions in a couple of years. Institutions are not like motors in a car where you take the carburetor's not working, and so the UN or the World Bank or AID or DFID comes in and puts a new carburetor, a judicial system, in place, and it's fully functional once you turn the ignition on. That's how people treat our programs too often. It's all written down on a little piece of paper, you put some money in it, you dump it in the engine, and all of a sudden the engine goes on and you're supposed to have the rule of law. I mean, that is ridiculous. One of the reasons that the United States has been successful in its history, in its own development, is because we had a functioning court system, common law based, British developed system, that existed for 150 years before the revolution. We developed our own state mechanisms, but it wasn't done in 6 years. It existed before, for 150 years before. It took a very long time to build it. We would not have been the country we developed into if that foundation didn't exist before the development of our independent government once we became independent of the British Empire. It was successful because that existed first. What we've done in many developing countries is we've gone in to provide public services rapidly, because that's what the international system is demanding. Our headquarters, our capitals are demanding it. The board of directors of the World Bank's demanding it. The advisory board of the UN agencies and the board of directors of NGOs are demanding it. That we go in and do this stuff very rapidly when in fact it cannot be done rapidly. When I was lecturing at National Defense University very recently, and it was fascinating because the office, these are 200 or 300 people, and they're not just Americans, they're from developing countries and from European countries. In order to become an admiral or a general in the US military, you have to go through this school to get your master's degree. It's a requirement. And I said, I explained what I've just explained now in terms that the military would understand. And the military said, well, you guys obviously aren't succeeding very well. You don't have functioning ministries in Afghanistan. I said, well, let me just ask you something. When did you start building the Afghan military? I believe, as I recall, that was started because I was in the interagency meetings on Afghanistan from the beginning. In January of 2002. It's 8 years later. Do you have a functional Afghan military that you, the NATO forces led by the United States, have built so successfully in 8 years? And the answer is, if we did, why would President Obama be sending more troops to Afghanistan? Obviously, you guys are incompetent at building institutions from a military standpoint. You don't know what you're doing. In the military sector, I'm not talking about our sectors, there was silence. They said, you're having the same problems we're having, except they're not problems. It's just the nature of reality. If they're built quickly, they will collapse quickly. If they're built quickly, they will collapse quickly. If a development program's on time with all the papers filed, it's probably a bad development program, because it does not realize that this is about not what we do, but what they do out there. And if the norms of a society function in a particular way that are counterintuitive to institution building, then you have problems in terms of implementation. So, those are my comments. I'm glad to have a discussion. Thank you very much.